Once again, it is the month of Halloween, October, and appropriately enough, due to a real-life Hinamizawa syndrome, it's also the month where they ended up releasing a certain reboot to one of my favorite anime of all time. I'm not in favor of the current events and all that, but just saying you have to find the silver lining in everything, am I right? Thus, for this month, I'm going to be making videos celebrating this franchise's return to television. And for those who have no idea what I'm talking about, here's a little summary of its origins and rise to fame. Higurashi no Nakoroni is a murder mystery series that was first introduced to otakudom at the summer comic market of 2002 with the original Onikakushihen sound novel, which is basically like a visual novel but without any actual gameplay and you just read along with it. It was scripted and illustrated by Ryukishi Reina, while his brother Yata Zarka, geez that name, put it into Enscriptor, a visual novel engine that was also used by a certain other fledgling company at the time. And yeah, obviously it wasn't the most visually appealing series at the time, but the intriguing mystery and psychological horror elements of Yukishi's writing grabbed everyone's attention. As a result, they managed to go to every preceding comic market until 2006 with a new story arc every time, resulting in an 8-chapter saga plus an epilogue. The former half introduced the series' many mysteries, and were therefore known as the question arcs, while the latter half answered everything and therefore was known as the answer arcs. Last year, I covered a manga adaptation of Ryukishi Reina's prototype script, The Hinamizawa Bus Stop, and if you didn't know anything about this franchise, would you have ever imagined this would end up becoming an 8-part epic? Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you consider the original tale was kind of a straightforward stage play that probably would have only required minimal production values. But here we are with a franchise that spun off into its own metaverse with several other series that contain When They Cry in the title. And yet, in spite of all of these other titles, they can't seem to help but come back to the original and just keep adding new extra arcs through stuff like the original anime and ports on pretty much every game console in existence. And while I do appreciate many of these stories, and think some of them are great, I do kind of wish they'd just leave it alone at this point, and let the original 8 question and answer arcs stand on their own. While I'm not exactly sure how the reboot is going to handle the original 8, I do hope at the very least they do it a little bit better than the original anime adaptation. Don't get me wrong, I still absolutely love the original anime and hold it in very high regard, but yeah, I also have to admit there are pacing issues with it, along with a lot of dropped material from the original sound novels, to the point that they even needed to create a full-on anime-only arc to fill in some plot holes. And unfortunately, they wouldn't learn this lesson by the time adapting Umineko came around, but that's a subject for another day. One thing I do think they did right was prioritizing more of their limited episode count to specific arcs. As while I do think every arc is good and significant to the overall story, there were some shards that shine brighter than others, which is what we're going to talk about today. With that, here's my personal rankings of the original 8 Q&A arcs of Higurashi no Nakoroni. A few obvious ground rules first. 1. We're going to stick to the original 8. No extra arcs like the aforementioned Aime Oni, Yakusumashihen, or Rei, the epilogue that came immediately after. Also, yeah, spoilers abound, so either go read the original sound novels, watch the original 52 Aime episodes, or come back whenever the reboot finishes. On a side note, I hope that show also gets at least 52 episodes, if not more. I will also provide quick summaries for each arc just for the sake of context. Last, I'm going to take all adaptations of these arcs into account because, yeah, there are significant changes and differences between the anime and manga for better and for worse. Ultimately, I will try to judge an arc mostly by its original sound novel, but we'll also take into consideration some of the better elements of all of its adaptations. With that in mind, let's just dive in. Taking place 5 years before any of the other arcs, a young detective named Mamoru Akasaka has been sent to the small rural town of Hinamizawa to help rescue the grandson of a government official. Along the way, he gets caught up in the protests against a dam construction project, and also meets a little girl named Rika Furude who might have a little more to her than she appears. I'll admit, this was a bit of an obvious choice. I mean, just look at the title for goodness sake. It's also worth noting this was the shortest arc in the original anime, only taking up 2 episodes. The anime staff honestly kind of lucked out because they managed to remove a lot of filler in the original sound novel from their workload. Yeah, I said they dropped a lot of stuff for the anime, but I didn't say it was all great stuff. Not unless you're really into Mahjong, which I'm not. That is, if it's not played by a bunch of cute anime girls with superpowers. But yeah, even the actual main plot of this arc, the kidnapping, ultimately wasn't all that important to this series in the long run. Most of all, for a series predicated on suspense horror, this is by far the least scary question arc. There are some chilly moments here and there that we'll get to in just a bit, but nothing that's going to keep you on the edge of your seat. All that aside, there are some good and essential elements here. Obviously, this arc introduced Akasaka, a character who would later become one of the most badass characters in the entire series, and his friendship with Rika was cute, which ultimately made the ending to this all the more tragic. This chapter also introduced us to what could be called the Dark Rika personality, and damn, this scene alone made Yukari Tamura my absolute favorite VA of all time.
Akasaka. 東京へ帰れ。あなたはさっさと東京に帰った方がいい。
But yeah, because of this, we also got to see the beginning of the tragic tale of Rika Furude, the girl who knew she couldn't escape her destiny and yet still wanted to cling on to some small strand of hope to find a way out of it. The ending to this is also great, especially in later adaptations where Akasaka's daughter Miyuki managed to get involved. Yeah, fun fact, this character was retconned into this arc in the manga and the PlayStation 2 game, as Ryukishi hadn't even given Akasaka's daughter a name by the time the original sound novels ended. And now she's currently one of the more significant Higurashi characters as the main character of their new mobile game. Which, from what I've heard, it's also a gacha game, as if I needed another hole in my wallet. But I digress. Miyuki gave this arc an additional sad layer to it as she began to resemble Rika, the girl Akasaka failed to save. Thus, he would make it his life's work to discover the truth about Hinamizawa, even publishing a very meta book. Yeah, I'll admit, I'm kind of a sucker for fourth wall breaking endings like this. Hence why I really can't dislike this chapter, even if it is just a time killer, until we reach its corresponding answer arc, which yeah, we'll get to that. Having just learned that one of his closest friends had a twin sister he had never heard of, Keiichi ends up getting caught up in the affairs of the Sonozaki family and their slightly shady activities. Things take an especially hard turn after Sadako and Rika disappear, and Mion seems to be at the root of it all, though could her twin Shion also be in on it? I'm probably overthinking things. I'll say right now, the Sonozaki twins are a couple of my favorite characters in all of the When They Cry metaverse. I just love their backstories and how writers can play up how we can never seem to really know who's who half the time. With that said, much like the last entry on this list, many of the problems of this arc can be summed up in just the title. There's some needless fluff here that, again, thankfully was cut from the original anime. Most notably, a whole scene where the club protected Shion from being harassed by some stereotypical otaku. Now, don't get me wrong, I do actually find this to be a pretty hilarious scene, especially in the manga adaptation thanks to Yutori Hojo's exaggerated art style. But it does drag on, and honestly I wouldn't mind if they also removed it from the 2020 remake. Along with that, it did kinda suffer from sequelitis, with much of the stuff we had already learned in the Onikakushi Hen being repeated here. I wouldn't say it's the fault of the arc itself, really, it's just nature of the beast when it comes to the structure of a series based around a Groundhog Day loop. Keiichi for these first 3 arcs is meant to be an unreliable narrator who needs to be kept in the dark. On that note though, I do think this is a much better arc than the Himatsubushi Hen, if only because it's damn scary at times, as poor Keiichi, and by extension us the readers, were still kept very much in the dark about the series' many mysteries. I'd say it's the second scariest question arc, especially in the manga adaptation. Again, while some of her stuff can look a little wonky, Hojo's very expressive faces work even better for horror at times. I won't spoil this for anyone who hasn't read the manga yet, but let's just say these final few pages, yeah, they still haunt my nightmares to this very day. Also, yeah, the anime could certainly be scary, but at the same time, it could also be hilarious. Thank you so much, Studio Dean. I will also say, for a chapter where supposedly Mion is the central character, Rena kind of steals the show. Not only is she still a hilarious goober, but she also really managed to show off her intuition and even managed to solve a murder mystery all by herself. Oh yeah, there's also a decent self-contained mystery in this arc, while also featuring the larger enigmas of the series. But yeah, Rena is awesome in this one, and I'm glad this is one of the few timelines where she, along with the rest of the town, survives as the Hinamizawa disaster never occurred. Granted, all of her friends are dead by the end, but hey, she might have a bright future as an insurance saleswoman.
皆さん保険とか入られてますか？よろしかったらいい保険を紹介しますけど。
Still, it's a good arc in my opinion, creepy otaku aside, but as you can guess, its follow-up is going to be a bit higher on this list. Having befriended the bride Sadako more than previous arcs, Keiichi ended up becoming somewhat of a surrogate brother to her. As a result, he ended up learning more about her actual brother Satoshi, and the fact that he probably didn't just go off a journey to become a Pokemon master. Things would soon take a very unpleasant turn after Sadako's uncle Teppei returned, and Sadako showed clear signs of mistreatment. Keiichi finds himself between a rock and a hard place as to how to approach the situation, and ends up going with the worst choice. This is arguably the darkest arc in what's already a pitch black series, and while I can't say much due to YouTube's restrictions, I'm sure you guys can fill in the blanks. I'll admit, I wouldn't be at all surprised if this arc ended up at the bottom of anyone else's list because it is just depressing at times. Sadako, while a bit of a divisive character for some, definitely didn't deserve what she suffered at the hands of a total piece of trash like her uncle. I'd imagine it'd be hard for anyone to read or watch this stuff as much as it is for the characters in the actual story. However, that's kind of why I think this is one of the better arcs, as it does tackle and even take a very hard stance on this sort of issue. Yes, what happened to Sadako was terrible and something should have been done, but doing it through such radical and extreme methods like Keiichi doesn't solve the core issues, and in some cases will only make things worse, as trauma is not something that just goes away even if you remove the physical source of it. And the fact that they do address this is fully appreciated, and they do justify such heavier subject matter in my opinion. To me, the worst thing a show or movie could do is bring up this sort of stuff and yet not take any sort of really solid stance on it or provide any meaningful commentary. You know what you did! I will say this is also the first arc where I didn't mind some of the filler, if only because A, it was legit hilarious and was thankfully properly animated in Kai, and B, the levity was definitely needed. And while these sorts of tone shifts can be found in pretty much every arc, considering what our main character went through, this one felt particularly poignant. Speaking of whom, this arc also gave us a peek into Keiichi's backstory, which I personally really relate with, but we'll discuss that more when we get to another arc. For now though, while this one exhibited Keiichi at arguably his lowest point, with him consciously choosing to take matters into his own hands, we could absolutely sympathize with his position, as the small group of friends he managed to make was slowly starting to fall apart. And yeah, he might have also been influenced by the Hinamizawa syndrome, but again, he went pretty straight into this, and was even thinking up ways of how to get away with it. It turned this arc into a gripping crime drama that ultimately ended the only way it could for the choices Keiichi made. On a side note, mad props to the manga typesetters. I do not envy anyone whose job it is to set up this amazing wall of text to get across Keiichi's mental breakdown. The curse killing arc is undoubtedly a hard one to get through, but I do think it's an important read, both for the sake of this series, as well as to make the reader think and reflect on this subject matter. Now, as for how it should be approached, well... We've reached the first answer arc to make this list, that just so happens to correspond with the previous entry. Having witnessed Keiichi alter the destiny of a previous world line where things did not usually end so well, Rika was hoping he could work that same magic to save her from her final destiny. Keiichi didn't seem to recollect those previous world lines events, but he was more than willing to help her. This would really be put to the test when Teppei once again returned. With time also ticking away until Rika's inevitable fate, the club members would have to work fast to try and avoid the title of this arc. Yeah, spoilery title aside, I still really love this arc. First of all, this was the arc that formally introduced us to one of my favorite characters, Hanyu. Yes, technically she had been around since the very beginning as Oyashiro-sama, but this was the first time we actually got to see the adorable demon loli who was always watching over Rika. As a result, this was also where the position of main character switched from Keiichi to Rika. Sure, he still had some very awesome moments where he really got to show off his character development with the influence of the previous world line starting to affect him. But yeah, this was definitely the point where Rika officially took over and the series was all the better for it. If anything, we did end up with some more fantastic performances courtesy of Tamura.
だから圭一がそんなことを言うなんて私は信じない。
By this point, these two had lost all hope of finding a way out of the loop, but by the end, not only was Rika's spirit renewed, Hanyu officially joined the team as well. More on the results of that a little bit later. As I said, this was the follow-up to the curse-killing arc, and god, this is heartwarming. Yes, they managed to rescue Sayako this time, and thankfully through all of the right channels, as I think Keiichi's dad put it best.
いろいろな戦いがあるが、ルールにのっとって戦わなければ
The majority of this arc focused mostly on the club members going around and campaigning to get help from both the authorities and the town's governing powers. Normally, politics would be a bit of a slog to get through in fiction, which is sort of the case here, though since it's Higurashi, they also have to make it as dramatic and over the top as possible too. Several times, they did almost resort to more violent methods, but in the end, they stayed the course and were rewarded properly. Yes, as violent and frankly over the top as this series can get, it does try to bring up the point that extremist methods just don't work. This of course even extended to the series' deeper lore. While the legends of Oyashiro-sama portray the deity as a vengeful god, we see that the genuine article is mostly a pacifist who doesn't want her people to constantly resort to violence. Of course, going the other extreme and just be a bystander doesn't solve anything either, as shown through Hanyu's inaction. I think people should take a stand when needed, and only through sincere and earnest campaigns. So yeah, on top of having some great commentary about some of Japan's broken judicial systems, it was overall a very touching little arc that constantly promoted one of the series' biggest themes of the importance of unity over division and dissension. As I said, even the apprehensive Hanyu joined the club and their efforts, after things didn't end so well. Yeah, even though they did manage to rescue Sadako, this arc did end on a downer, but also a well laid out downer, as the club still managed to work together and even had some dying moments of awesome, which of course would then lead into the series' final concluding arc. Though before we get there, why don't we take a look at how we got here in the first place? This was the arc that immediately preceded the last entry, and yet again, Teppei was causing trouble for our protagonist, though this time for Rena, along with some help from his partner, Rina, a woman who was dating Mr. Ryugu. Yep, they were setting up Rena's father for a honey trap. Not wanting to stand back and watch her father go through another disastrous relationship after her mother cheated and divorced the poor guy, she tried to resolve things on her own. And while one of them was kind of in self-defense and the other was Teppei, she still dug herself into a hole. And while her friends honestly tried to help cover things up for her, that probably wasn't the right call for someone who was slowly succumbing to paranoia. These events also started to have an effect on Keiichi, leading to the two having a legit clash for the ages. The original anime very wisely chose this as the arc to close out the first season. Not only did we get the very awesome climax of Keiichi versus Rena, with the former just being his usual hilariously boisterous self, but it was also a fantastic emotional climax for many of the early mysteries of the series. After all, this was the answer arc for the very first arc in the series, which obviously we'll get to in just a bit, but for now, I'll just point out how this was meant to be an inversion of that story, with Keiichi realizing he had made similar mistakes as Rena in that world line. This led into one of the most powerful scenes in the series, and in general, one of my favorite moments in all of anime that would make absolutely no sense for anyone who didn't have proper context.
本当にすまなかった。おはぎ、うまかったぜ。
Also, I love the visual novel adaptation of this arc, which had just some excellent music to complement this scene. As I mentioned earlier, this was also the arc where we got to learn more about Keiichi's past, and how he became a bit of a rotten kid because of many societal pressures after being enrolled in some advanced classes for kids with different thought processes. I'll save talking about that for another video. This, of course, added fuel to Ren's distrust, and also yet another major theme of the series: the importance in trusting in others. Chances are always likely that a friend is going to have some secrets they want to keep to themselves, and we can either accept this inevitability, or become a paranoid psychopath. This arc really highlighted that theme as it built towards its importance in the final 2 arcs. Hell, it even followed them into other shows.
レナとは戦えないので揺るがない信じる心で惨劇を乗り越えた僕たちにやり合う気なんてないのです。
For that, I think this is a really strong plot, and my only real complaint is how much of a cartoon villain Rena became by the end. I mean, yeah, I get that the Hinamizawa syndrome was making her crazy, but it's also a little ridiculous how she managed to set up the school to explode like this. I still liked how grand this finale felt for the first season of the anime, but still, come on, this is a little much.
It always stops at 1 on the show.
Still, great stuff that just barely misses the top 3 for me, but as you can tell, I did like the prequel more than the sequel. And thus, we've reached the arc that started it all. Keiichi Maibara had recently moved from the big city to the backwater village of Hinamizawa. There, he managed to make friends with a group of all girls. Can you tell this is an anime? And through them, he learned about his new home's unique traditions and customs. Though he then started to learn a little too much, especially in regard to a cancelled dam project and the unrest it had generated, including several mysterious deaths. Worst of all, his new friends seemed to know a little more than they were letting on. Really, I had to put this in the top 3. I mean, without this, and especially the original anime adaptation, we wouldn't have some of the most memorable moments in all of anime that we still reference to this day. Stuff like this and Shuffle's anime adaptation put Yandere on the map. For those reasons alone, I think this deserves a top spot. And while I still like all of the other arcs, and obviously still have 2 more higher than this one, I also don't think any other chapter has filled me with as much dread as this first one. Granted, a lot of that might have come from the fact that this was our first experience with this series, and their slow, yet extremely methodical burn to the climax. Still, because there was such a focus on Keiichi and his developing distrust towards the club, the tension just felt so much more palatable, especially during Rena's most infamous scenes. Of course, the impact of these scenes only got better once voices were added on, as Mai Nakahara knocked it out of the park, as these birds can attest. With all that said though, this arc kind of gets even better upon rewatch or read after you've taken the previous entry on this list. With the knowledge that Keiichi is suffering from the Hinamizawa syndrome, we end up questioning how much of what he saw and heard was real. This was one of the strongest aspects of Ryuki's original screenplay and was very thankfully carried over into this. Because now, the once threatening Rena comes off as the sympathetic protagonist, while Keiichi becomes the unstable antagonist. There are just so many layers to this first arc that I can't help but find a new appreciation for it every time I watch or read it again. This was how the franchise broke into the business, and boy, did they break things. Acting as the answer to the Cotton Drifting arc, we switch perspectives from the naive protagonist Keiichi to the antagonist Shion. Yep, that chapter pulled a fast one on us, as Mion was never the villain. Or maybe she kind of was, as this chapter delved into the very complicated backstory of the twins and the Sonozaki clan in general. Through this arc, we saw the fall of one unwanted member of this clan, both in the figurative and literal sense. While I still think the Curse Killing arc was the hardest to get through because of the subject matter, I also do think this one is hard to get through, and yet it's so engaging that you actually kind of want to guide out, fingernails be damned. This chapter made Shion one of my favorite Higurashi characters ever. Not for likability, oh no. She becomes an outright demon by the end, as she herself even admits, and yet is also one of the series' most interesting characters in my opinion. Her descent and final villainous form gave me a lot of Light Yagami vibes. Hell, try and tell me this isn't the most Keikaku Dori face you've ever seen. Yet, unlike Mikira, they actually succeeded in making her into a sympathetic monster. Yeah, remember how they tried to do that with him and failed twice? Still, yeah, I personally really like these sorts of crime dramas where we get to see a mostly average person evolve into a criminal mastermind. The fact she does it with such sadistic glee makes it all the more thrilling and satisfying. Seriously, between the manga and anime adaptations, I could spend all day showing some of Shion's amazingly evil expression. To me, this is the best kind of character I love to hate. One who we can't forgive their actions, and yet have to admire how they managed to pull it all off. Though ironically, she also became the somewhat unsung savior of Hinamiza, as again, by hiding Rika's body, she prevented the disaster from occurring. I think I can hear Light crying in a corner. This arc also did a great job at making Shion a very sympathetic character, in spite of everything she did. I mean, yeah, I don't think most of us have a family as tied up in backwards politics as the Sonozaki clan, but the practice of preferential treatment among siblings is all too common. Yet, the actual relationship between the twins was so sweet that you wouldn't be able to tell at first. In fact, Shion initially had some very amiable relationships with several characters up until the big turning point of the arc when things went south fast. Still, we could at least understand why things went as wrong as they did, as this arc really went into depth about this character and her deteriorating mental state. Much of it, of course, being the result of her loving Satoshi Hojo a tad bit too much. Yeah, I wouldn't call this the romance of the ages, but they were still cute together, and regardless, he was one of the few people in her life who showed her genuine kindness. Thus, it's not surprising that losing him would awaken something within her. And the most tragic part of this tale was that she had multiple opportunities to choose the better path, and yet through a combination of the Hinamizawa syndrome and her own inherent feelings of inadequacy, she couldn't escape from the demon's grasp. All of this boiled over to some of the most intense scenes in the series. On a side note, this scene from the anime could have been a lot better. I mean, it was still good, especially thanks to Satsuki Yukino's amazing performance, but they unfortunately left out a key reveal that I'll save talking about for another time. Regardless, this isn't an ending that, no matter how many times or whatever version it is, I'll admit, I get a little teary-eyed every time. Probably the most powerful version of this was the manga adaptation, in which, yet again, Shion was given an opportunity as she managed to initially survive a fall that would have killed her, but really at that point, her life had spiraled so out of control, what was even the point? And in her final moments, she saw visions of a much better world line where, in spite of everything that had happened to her, she managed to find true happiness, unlike here, where her final words were, "I'm sorry for being born." This arc is certainly eye-opening in more ways than one, and in terms of just a pure emotional story, I think this actually might be my favorite. With all that said though, let's not end this list on such a downer. We end this list with the arc that originally ended it all. After an extended prologue where we learned the origins of a genocidal psychopath, as well as wrapped up several hanging plot threads, we entered into a world line where Hanyu managed to materialize and actually interact with the club. She would be needed as Rika failed to save her last game and thus had no idea Takano was the real big bad of the series. With their time loop mulligan seemingly depleted, Rika and Co would have to make this last one count by bringing in not just the club, but also every ally they had made up until this point. This is one of the greatest conclusions to anything I've ever seen across all of the media it's available on. You can keep your endgames and whatnot. To me, this is 1,000 times better, and also has far less confusing time travel nonsense. I guess the best way to describe this is that it's composed of two halves. The first half is a dramatic, yet still very intriguing tale focusing on Takano's very tragic and admittedly needlessly cruel backstory. Still, at least this led us to getting some answers to many hanging plot threads, which was very cathartic. In the process, we even get some strong character moments for Rena, Mion, and even Oreo. Yes, even the Onibaba got a good character moment. That's how insane this final arc is. Meanwhile, the second half is a super hyped race to the finish with everyone getting a crowning moment of awesome that I can't even describe. It's just that amazing. Everyone from our mains to even some of the minor side characters got a moment. 4 words: don't piss off Kasai. It all culminated in an epic final encounter with Takano that ends the only way a series with these sorts of themes could.
Just this once! Everybody lives!
I mean, just as long as you don't count the people in the flashbacks. But yeah, the fact that these two halves contrasted so much really illustrated the two opposite paths the club members and Takano ended up walking down, making this final encounter between them all the more exciting. Hanyu especially had some awesome encounters with her, and I especially love the anime's adaptation of this final scene for the most part. Yeah, I'm more than a little disappointed that they didn't include a scene of Rika using Zawaldo, but that's what remakes are for. Plus, just seeing everyone resolve their issues both with themselves and each other really gave some good finality to their individual arcs. Did all these resolutions kind of make this arc feel a little overstuffed? Maybe, but at the same time, after all of the dark stories we've gone through, like the last one on this list, you kind of want to take it all in. Regardless, I think this final arc best represents the themes and messages this series tries to get across. Violence, while it can be a little persuasive, shouldn't be the only answer, as actual hatred will only beget more hatred. And if you ever feel like you can't do something on your own, you should never feel like you can't ask for a little help. Everyone working together managed to create a miracle for one girl whose 1,000-year journey had finally come to an end. While some series that preceded it might have been objectively better, I'll still admit I have a soft spot in me for this wonderful series. It has great characters, some wonderful world building, it can be absolutely terrifying at times, but also just as heartwarming. I'll always look forward to revisiting this series in some form, including the upcoming reboot. And no matter how that turns out, I can always look back on some good old memories too. Well, that's all I have to say. This video really came out a little longer than I originally expected, but as I said, it was a lot of fun to revisit this stuff, and this isn't going to be my only video I'm planning for the month of Halloween, so look forward to more in the oncoming weeks. And until then though, farewell for now my friends, and if you excuse me, I think I'm gonna go visit a certain lab to see if I can research world lines a little more.